So welcome to today's event, Hosting Online Events. This is a new thing that the Digital Learning Network are trying out. Short talks held at lunchtime or thereabouts with somebody who has a little bit of experience in the field, not necessarily an expert or a specialist. And we hope that you will find something interesting from this. I'm going to speak to you a little bit and try and get a feel from you as participants as to how experienced you might be in this. And I'm hoping that I might be able to learn a little bit from you, and that hopefully I've got a few things that you might be able to take away from this. We're hoping that with the Digital Learning Network that we'll be doing a few more of these events in the future, not necessarily monthly, but every few months. Some of you may see that the Digital Learning Network already hosts a regular monthly event on Twitter, the DLNet Chats, and that usually covers a range of topics from looking at equipment and tools and digital techniques to a range of other issues, including looking at how we can better incorporate things like equality and diversity into our practices. So do keep an eye on the DLNet JISC mail and on the DLNet Twitter, which will explain all about that. And I'll give those addresses towards the end of the talk. So welcome to today. My name's Stuart Berry. I'm on the Digital Learning Network Committee and have been on the committee for a few years now. I'm joined, I can see Sean is another committee member, is in the audience today. Sean's giving us a wave. Thanks, Sean. There may be a couple of other committee members that join us as well. It's worth noting that we're a completely voluntary run organisation. We receive no funding and we don't charge for a great deal of what we do. We have in the past charged for some events, but a lot of what we do these days tends to be free. So we're not even a registered charity. We're just I think we're a constituted group, and we're a network and an advocacy group for digital in the cultural sector. As I say, I'll pass on all the links and the addresses to the places where you can find out more about the Digital Learning Network at the very end. But if those of you haven't engaged yet with the Digital Learning Network, please do have a look, because there's lots of really interesting and informative stuff we're doing. The Digital Learning Network started quite a few years ago when digital was a really new thing in the cultural sector. And I think over the last couple of years, in light of the pandemic especially, we've all had to kind of adapt very quickly to doing things digitally. So I think there are a lot more people now more confident with digital and doing more and more things with digital, which is obviously a great thing. My other role is with an organisation called Planed. We're based in West Wales in Pembrokeshire, where I am the cultural projects coordinator, and that's my day job, if you like. I was going to be joined today by a colleague, John, who also works with me at Planed, and we've hosted a variety of online events over the last couple of years. John, unfortunately, in the times we live in, John has COVID, and this morning emailed me to say he was too unwell to be able to join us today. So I'm afraid you've just got me. One of the things we were actually going to talk about was with online events that it's great if there's two of you, because it means that one, you can have a break from speaking, but also if your train of thought starts to wander, there's a second person who can kind of jump in and steer things back onto track. And that's especially useful when you're doing long events, and we've done sort of day-long conference events, myself and other colleagues, and it's always useful there, especially if you can get a couple of co-hosts, because it means you can sort of do a relay between the two of you. So we're not joined by John, so I'm afraid you've just got me today. What I am going to do, I'm going to very quickly, and again, this is sort of a bit of good practice, I always nominate a co-host. So because Sean is the other committee member on the call today, I'm going to nominate Sean as a co-host. This means that if for any reason my signal does drop, if for any reason I have any technical difficulties, it means that the meeting will still be held by Sean. So it means you won't lose us, and Sean will just have to fill in. I'm hoping it won't. Typically, though, with the pandemic and one thing or another, most people are back in the office. I'm working from home today, but typically today my son's school is on inset, so my broadband is having to fight with live streamed Fortnite in another room. So I'm hoping I've told him to keep it to a minimum. So hopefully we shouldn't see any signal dropping through that today. I always start an online session as well, particularly with new audiences, with a bit of housekeeping and a bit of general kind of what my expectations are with audiences. I'm sure everybody here is more than familiar with these sorts of rules, but as I say, my intention was to host today's online event in the way that I would hope to see others hosting events too. And I think it's always worth starting off with a couple of quick housekeeping notes. And as I say, these are all fairly self-explanatory. I'm not going to read through them. The other thing I usually start off by saying at this point, especially with certain groups of and certain audiences, is that I can be sometimes quite an assertive host, and I will assertively put people on mute if there's any distracting background noises. And I think if you're hosting events, you shouldn't be too shy of doing that, because whether it's pets or children or other kind of noises in the background, other co-workers sometimes, and I've heard all sorts of conversations, you know, people discussing what they're having for dinner tonight and that sort of thing, which people just don't realize they're on mute. So don't be hesitant to be sort of quite aggressive. Sometimes actually people can have slight technical difficulties and you might get a bit of feedback or what have you. So asking people to be on mute is particularly important, particularly in a meeting of this nature where you've got a large number of people. It's easy for people to sort of slip in and out. So I always make an apology at the start to say to people, I am pretty assertive by putting people on mute if there is any distracting noises, so please don't take it personally, and I'd advise others to follow suit there. Again, digital hands are there, so if anybody does have a question, please do. It's quite a small informal meeting today, so if you do have a question or comment, stick the digital hand up. I'll try to keep an eye on that, but sometimes when you're kind of hosting through a screen, you can't always spot it. So Sean, I'm hoping that you're going to jump in and give me a hand if you spot anybody that has got a digital hand up that I've not spotted. Similarly, if you want to put a question in the chat, I'll try and pick them up as we go through. But again, when you've got a screen share going on, it's not always possible to spot the chat. So again, Sean, if you spot anything in the chat that you want me to address, I'd be grateful if you just shout out, and we'll try and do it as we go along. As I've said, the session is being recorded, so anybody not wishing to feature in the recording, please do keep your camera off. And with that in mind, we'll crack on. Now, I mentioned the DLNet chat, the Twitter chat that we do regularly. We had a chat last Friday, which looked at online sessions. So we're going to try and make sure we incorporate some of the views that were raised in that today, as well as hopefully give people that were part of that chat a bit of added value as well. One of the things that was mentioned in that was about speakers keeping to time, because when you join a session and you promise it's only an hour, the last thing you want is to be kept on. So I am going to try and do this quite quickly and rush through it today, but please do, if you've got any questions or comments that we're not able to do within the hour today, please do get in touch with me afterwards, or get in touch with any of the Digital Learning Network Committee, and we'll try and point you in the right direction for any help or advice or any other bits of information that we can give. So we're going to cover a few things. We're going to talk very quickly about the essentials at the start, and I think it's always a useful place to start. I mean, most of this will be fairly self-explanatory and will be things that you're already probably doing, but I think just to make sure it's a level playing field from the outset, we're going to talk about those bits to start us off. We're going to then cover very quickly sort of some ideas around platforms and formats. These things will differ from organisation to organisation, from audience to audience, and according to what capacity, technology, software, hardware, and so on that you use within your organizations. But we're going to have a look at, think about some of those and think about how we might best adapt them, just some of the considerations you might make in choosing formats and platforms for events. We're going to very quickly cover hybrid events. And again, there's no real one golden answer to these things. So we're going to talk a little bit around some of the considerations you might want to think about when putting on a hybrid event. And again, if we've got people here that are experienced, I'm more than happy to make this more discursive and for others to speak up and give their views and give their experience too. But if you do have any questions, let us know. And then we'll come to the end, we'll talk about some additional things you might want to be thinking about when hosting online events. And in there, we're going to cover things like whether we charge for an online event, whether we need translation features, what kind of interactivity we might incorporate. I tend to think of those as being more advanced than sometimes, but sometimes they are essential according to the nature of the audiences we're working with or according to what we want to do. And then we're going to finish off with a bit of an open Q&A. So please do, as I say, though, if you've got any questions as we're going along, stick something in the chat or raise a virtual hand. I'm going to start things off, though, with, whilst we're on this one, bear with me. A quick poll, actually. I wanted to get an idea from the audience that are here of your own experience of doing online events. So I'm going to launch a poll now. I don't know if anybody's used this. This is one simple way of doing some interactivity. So you should see on your screen a question which says, what is your experience of hosting online events? There's a couple of typos in there I'm spotting as I'm reading it. It just shows how when you do these things hastily. But please do fill in your fill in where you think you are on that sort of scale of your experience, because it'd be really useful to know what sort of audience we're talking to, and then it'll mean I can adapt perhaps a little bit about what I'm saying. Okay, so looking like fairly evenly distributed around the middle three: attending but never organised, hosted one or two simple events, hosted a few events, then a couple of people with no experience whatsoever. Okay, I'm going to share those results just so you can sort of see. So I don't know if you can say, you should be able to see a little graph showing the percentages there. So I don't know if anybody's used polls before. This is quite a useful tool in events, especially when you're talking to an audience such as this and you want to kind of get a feel for people's views and opinions. And you can sometimes have a poll at the start and one at the end, so you can do kind of evaluation to see how people, what their feelings were at the start, or what their knowledge or skills or confidence was like at the start, or well-being, and you can then measure that at the end and kind of do a comparative. If you want to do an evaluation in that way, you can kind of add it to, you can do all sorts of things. And there are some more complicated, this is just a simple multiple choice question, but there are some more complicated polls that you can do within events. So this is quite a simple, straightforward, interactive. And I'm going to talk about interactives more at the end. I think one important thing is always consider the role that the interactive is playing. And this one's useful for me, might not necessarily be as interesting for you, but it tells me where my audience is, and it's going to help me to understand and better adapt my content for you. So I've got a bit of an idea of that. We'll move on. We'll talk a little bit about the first thing in my sort of list. So we'll talk about the essentials, and I think really the very first starting point whenever you're doing an online event is quite simply think about who you're aiming the event at, who's the audience, and what do you want the outcomes for the event to be. And I think that's going to inform a great deal going forward, because once you know who your audience is, it might inform sort of what time of day, what day of the week, what platform you use, what format you use. If you know your audience, you might know things like whether they work in the daytime, you might know their levels of digital confidence. And if you know the geography, it might inform a little bit also about whether they've got good network coverage. It might inform a whole range of other things. Knowing your audience and knowing the outcomes will also help you inform really whether it should be an online event, because sometimes we might think that actually we should be having these events at a venue and in person. But again, if we can identify this at the start, we can add that validation as to why we're choosing it to be an online event, and then what we want to do with it, what the format will be. So again, in terms of the outcomes, we think about what we want to achieve with this, what do people want to know. And I think that's, again, really important. So will it be a short event like today's short talk with a Q&A? Will it be a longer event like a morning session? Will it have lots of interactivity? So again, thinking about those outcomes will inform all those sort of things that you want to get out of it and what the best mechanism for achieving those outcomes will be. So it sounds pretty obvious, but I think if your starting point is always identifying quite specifically who your audience is, and then secondly, what you want to achieve with that audience, you can go on to then make sure you're making the right choices going forward with events. And I think this is a really important consideration. Particularly then we'll look at later thinking about kind of hybrid events and the difficulties there. And audience and outcomes can be particularly informative when you're thinking about the different experiences between the online audience and the in-person audience at a hybrid event, and what their different experiences and expectations will be, and therefore why it's a hybrid event and not strictly in person or strictly online, for instance. So these two are incredibly useful starting points. I think, as I said, that these will then tell you why the event is online, why you're doing it specifically online as opposed to in person, and that will then help you work out the rest from there. I think also when you're at this point, once you've arrived here, and in terms of the essentials, it's not on this slide, but I think then you need to then think about from the practicalities of where you're going to do the event from. So today, as you can see, I'm doing it from my kitchen table. Sometimes you might be doing it from an office or from a conference facility in your place of work. You might have a dedicated room for doing this sort of event. But it's quite important to consider that obviously during the pandemic, and particularly during the lockdown, we weren't able to get into our places of work. So it had to be done from a domestic setting. Now we've got a bit more freedom, so we can do it from work. You might want to think about how good is the broadband infrastructure in the place where you're doing it from, whether there's going to be any distractions. So whether your 12-year-old is going to come and pester you for food at a really inappropriate time, whether your pets are going to be barking, whether your colleagues are going to be talking in the background, all those sorts of things. Also about just generally what the setting is like, what the lighting levels can be like. I've done events from home, but had the sun in the wrong place, and I just end up a silhouette in front of a bright background. So all of those things do need to be thought about in terms of the time of day and the place you're doing it from, but they're all easily overcome too. But it's worth just making sure you've got all that ironed out at the start. But as I say, these two ideas of audience and outcomes are most essential to think of from the outset. Moving forward, in terms of platforms and formats, the online meeting using something like Zoom or Teams is probably the simplest way to do an online event, and certainly for short events like the ones we're doing today, it's ideal. You don't need anything particularly more complicated, and if you're not looking to add any additional functionality, Zoom can actually do quite a lot. You can do polls. There's a kind of a whiteboard feature built into it now, and you can do quite a lot with this. You can also do things like spotlight the speakers. So if you're having a dialogue, you can spotlight yourself. You can obviously do the screen share. You can share videos. You can do all sorts of things. So there's quite a lot you can do within just a straightforward Zoom meeting, and other platforms like Teams and like the Google Meet platform have similar capabilities built in. Some other organizations will use their specific platforms in-house. I know some organizations which use a platform called Lifesize. Some people use the Cisco, the WebEx system, and there's a whole range of other systems. Most of those systems at the most basic level will be quite easy for doing that. But again, going back to that idea of audience, thinking about who your audience is. If you've got a sort of a particularly unique system that you use in-house, but you're talking to a community audience, they may not be familiar with things like Cisco or Lifesize or any of those other more obscure ones. They will be more accustomed to Zoom. Many people are. There may be issues, for instance, with Teams. Not everybody will have access to Teams if you've not got the right Microsoft access or account, and I have had difficulty working with people on Teams before. So again, this is where understanding who your audience is at the outset will help you understand what the best platform is to use for that audience. If you're talking to an in-house audience, obviously use the in-house software that you're using. If you're talking to other professionals, there may be particular professional platforms, or the platforms that work better with that professional audience. There's no one right answer there, but it's really a case of knowing your audience and knowing what will work better for them. And again, thinking about things like access to the software, access to sort of digital literacy and digital capacity in terms of what people are used to using and interacting with. So the meeting is quite a straightforward starting point. I'm just having a look. There's a couple of comments in the chat, just seeing what we've got going on there. Zoom also has a webinar feature, and I'm assuming some of the other platforms do. I tend to use Zoom the most because it's quite flexible, but Zoom has a webinar feature, and the webinar feature is useful particularly for bigger kind of conference type events where you've got more audiences. It has a larger audience capacity. The other useful thing about the webinar is from both the point of view of the speaker and perhaps from the delegate, the attendee, is that all the attendees are automatically hidden. That obviously has limitations in that you kind of remove some of the interactivity that you might get in more of a roundtable meeting type setting, but it means that you don't get any of the kind of the privacy issues or people kind of jumping into meetings or any of that sort of thing. Nobody can kind of become a distraction, whether intentional or unintentional. So there are some useful things. With the webinar feature, though, that is an additional paid for feature on Zoom. But what you can do with Zoom certainly is just pay for 1 month's additional subscription. So you can bump up your membership for a month and then perhaps pack a couple of events in on there. It's not hugely expensive. I think it's something like about £70 or so for a month to jump on the webinar feature. And that does give a huge range of additional functionality. We'll talk about it later on, but if you want language translation, and as I mentioned at the start, I'm working in West Wales, so quite often we do things bilingual in English and Welsh, and so if we want that function, we need the webinar capacity in order to add a Welsh language translator into the equation as well. So if you're thinking about translation, you do need to think about webinars, or at least on Zoom. Live streaming is another potential way to go. You can live stream directly to platforms such as YouTube or Facebook. You don't necessarily need a Zoom or anything like that. I tend to manage it still through a Zoom account, and there is a way that you can live stream your Zoom meeting straight onto YouTube or Facebook. I don't think Zoom allows you to do both at the same time, but there are ways around that, and there are bits of technology that you can get that will allow you to live stream onto multiple platforms from Zoom. And obviously the beauty of doing it from Zoom is that you can host separate speakers who are in different locations. If you live stream direct to YouTube, unless you've got lots of equipment or particularly complicated setups, it's more difficult to do that way. So there are lots of options. And again, thinking back to that first issue of who your audience is and what you want to do with the event, why you're doing it online, and how and what you want to achieve, will pretty much dictate to you whether you're going to do it as a simple, straightforward meeting, whether it's going to be perhaps a longer form event, and whether you might think about the additional functionality offered by the webinar functionality, or whether you're going to live stream it in addition. And I've done some meetings, some events, I should say, where we've had some people in person in the meeting, but we've also then live streamed it. So you kind of create then two tiers of participants, some who are in the room, as it were, and can participate and be interactive, but then others who can sort of dip in and dip out on YouTube. Obviously, though, you have to be mindful of what that creates in terms of that audience, that you are in effect creating tiers. And if you're happy to do that, and if you think your audience will be happy to only access on the basis that they do, then that's fine, but it does obviously come with some limitations. I'm just going to see very quickly if there's any questions coming in. Thanks to Nathan. There's a few comments coming in there. Thanks for those comments, Nathan. I can see Sean is fielding those. So great stuff. Unless there's any other questions from there, we'll move on. I'm mindful time is sort of ticking on, and we said we'd give plenty of time for questions at the end, and so. In terms of hybrid events, and I've mentioned some of this already, it's really important to know who your audiences are, and that's who your audience for your in-person part of the hybrid event and who your audience is for the online part of the event. Who are those audiences going to be? What's the differences in their experiences going to be? And are you happy for those differences to exist? Because obviously there are some huge advantages of doing it this way, but it does create a differentiated experience between the two. And so I think it's really important to try and identify and consider who those different audiences are going to be. It's a really, really important question, I think, when designing events. The next thing that you kind of really need to look at, I think, is the sort of equipment that you're going to need. And this goes hand in hand really with the location of the venue. You're obviously going to need a venue where you can fit a suitable capacity in the venue, but also that's got the right kind of equipment infrastructure to allow for you to film the event, to broadcast to your online audience. And I think this can be difficult. I know more and more venues are now tackling this problem. And I know certainly a lot of the conferencing and performance venues in my location are able to do this and do have the capacity to do this, but it's sometimes worth sort of having a chat with them about how they will approach this. And I know there's still quite a few organisations that are sort of slightly uncertain. I think there is more specialist equipment needed for hybrid events. You are going to need to think about particularly microphones, whether you need roving microphones. Think about kind of cameras that might capture. So again, it depends on the format of the sort of the event. If whether it's going to be a panel type event where there might be lots of speakers, or whether it's a single speaker addressing an audience, because you might need different sorts of cameras, different sorts of equipment. So you can get sort of lots of mics set up to capture lots and lots of people, or you might need one roving mic that can be passed around, or you might need a system where people are using lapel mics. You might also need cameras that can, again, you have now smart cameras that will have a sort of a panoramic view, but they'll home in on where they hear the noise coming from in order to make sure that the speaker is the person that's kind of broadcast to your online audience. So you need to think about all of those sorts of things. Often better if you don't have that equipment, or you're unsure, to use a venue that does have that equipment, certainly at first, so you can kind of become accustomed to doing that sort of thing, but also be mindful of the limitations of what that equipment can do. And I think going forward, hybrid events will become more and more common, but I think it's going to be really, really important to ask, as I say, why is this hybrid? What is the online audience going to get out of it? What's the difference between that online audience and the in-person audience? And I think some of the other questions that we might think about as we go on might kind of come back to that difference in the audience and the difference in their sort of their experience. There is certainly a place for hybrid events, and I think as we go on, certainly we think about the big sector-wide conferences, and I'm thinking about things like the Museums Conference, the GEM Conference. They're now looking at kind of hybrid events, and it'll be really interesting to see, with that in mind, how they're handled there. But I think, again, it's really important to look at all these differentiations between what the people in person are experiencing, what the people online are experiencing, and particularly if you're charging for those events. Yeah, the built-in microphones on computers aren't great. I'm using my built-in microphone today, and the sound quality isn't always great. Using a headset can be really useful, even just on a simple, cheap sort of gaming type headset. Can be the quality of the audio can be much better than the built-in microphone, and even sort of small upgrades to equipment like an improved camera, particularly if you're working from your desk and your camera isn't necessarily at the right level, it can just add a whole dimension. I think it's really important to think in terms of your setup, where your camera is, and I think having it at eye level is really important. And so if you've got an external camera, again, but also having it in a place where you're looking, because we're not natural broadcasters or presenters, we're all kind of office employees, really, aren't we? So I think having the camera somewhere where you're going to look at it is great. Personally as well, whenever I'm doing an event, just thinking about equipment there, I always prefer to do it from 2 screens as well, and I think it's easier if you've got one screen that's got the sort of all the tech stuff on it, like the meeting and what have you, and then a second screen that might have any notes or your slides or any other bits and pieces that you need to be addressing, and also you can kind of better handle things like the chat. And certainly if you're doing a live streaming through YouTube, you might want to have a couple of screens, one even showing the live stream on YouTube and monitoring the live chat, because it's really hard to do that just from one screen unless you've got multiple windows open and you're able to look at all the little windows. So I think that's an important consideration. But I think this goes back to, again, when we think about the setting of where we're doing the online event from, and thinking about things like, how are we going to arrange all of the equipment to make sure that the event looks as at its best and as good as it can be. Sean's offering to do a live microphone test. I think that would be good. But we do have a question. Hang on. Victoria's asking, if you're to host a hybrid event in a remote environment with bad Wi-Fi, are there any solutions you can think of? I have done this. We did a live streamed event from an outdoor setting, and in the end we had to do it. We had to do it from our phone, and during the event, and obviously the signal wasn't great. We live in an area where at the time we yet to have 5G, so it was a sort of a slightly dubious 4G connection, and that connection could just about handle us doing the broadcast, but whenever we tried to do a screen share, particularly if we were trying to share video, it wouldn't work. So what we had to do was we needed a colleague who joined the event back from the office. They were added as a co-host, and then whenever we wanted to kind of queue up a video, they would then queue it up from back in the office. So I think certainly if you're doing it from a remote event, you've got bad Wi-Fi, you're having to do it off your phone, having a backup who's in an office who can just hold the event, carry the event, again, if your signal does drop, or to do any screen sharing stuff can be really useful. I always think it's useful, as I've said earlier on, to have a couple of people who are kind of co-hosts, and you've got kind of backups and other people in place to do that sort of thing. But that has been our solution, again, as I say, just to have somebody in an office who's able to kind of carry it in case the signal drops, but also to do all the screen sharing stuff, which takes some of the pressure off the Wi-Fi or the kind of the phone signal that you're using in situ. So in terms of extras, the things that I'm thinking of here are things around pricing, things like translation, but also there are lots of accessibility features, which we probably shouldn't think about as being extras, but sometimes they can be a second consideration. And then also interactivity. Personally, I think about pricing, I think certainly you really need to consider, again, it goes back to who the audience are and what you're doing it for. Obviously, if you're doing the event as part of a funded program and the event's funded, you probably don't need to price it because your costs are already being covered by the funding. I think if sometimes people do put a price on just to make sure those who book actually attend, that can work, but again, you need to think about issues around audience, and I think some organizations still have some issues around taking payment for remote events. It's difficult, or it's more difficult sometimes, taking remote payments and things like that. Mostly those issues have been ironed out, I think, by now, but I think one of the real barriers to pricing is that sort of the idea of what if there's a technical problem. are people entitled to kind of claim some part of their money back? How do you identify where the fault was? You know, if my signal drops, do I need to refund all of you? I mean, you've got into today's event for free, but if it were a paid for event, if my signal dropped, would I need to refund all of you? If you got 75% of the way through the event and heard most of it, would you get a 25% refund? So I think you need to, if you are going to institute a pricing policy, you really need to think about what your refunds policy is going to be at the same time. I think you also need to think about what the price of that online event would look like next to an in-person equivalent. So, and think about what the costs are covering when you're doing it in person. So when you're at a venue, you might want to cover the venue hire, or the costs to deal with the venue hire, like the staffing. You may also want to cover costs like things like the catering, teas and coffees, refreshments, that sort of thing. And there may be a couple of other costs that you need to cover when you're thinking about pricing. Obviously, some of those costs are removed when you're doing an online event. You may still want to cover the cost of your own time. But as I say, if that's what you're looking to do, I think you really do need to look at what your refund policy is as well when you're looking at pricing. I think pricing also, the question about pricing really comes into play when you think about hybrid events. And I think, you know, if you've got big conferences that are charging hundreds of pounds for several days, and people want to join online as an economic alternative, I think you really need to think about what the pricing of that economic alternative is. I think obviously we all want to save money, and we haven't all got big budgets to spend on transport or overnight accommodation, particularly for bigger conferences and events. But I think the joining of the hybrid, the online, you know, it is a significantly reduced experience in a number of ways, and it is subject to potential technical difficulties. And I think that you need to consider, therefore, what the pricing is for on that sort of thing. So there's a lot of questions to ask, but I think, you know, really look at what your actual costs are, look at whether you need to cover the costs, but then really, really important is about that refunds policy, particularly around the issue of if people have technical difficulties, and how people will go about claiming refunds and that sort of thing. Look at what other events are doing, look at what they're pricing for. We've done some events. One event that I did last year was a day conference, and it had been an in-person event in the past. An in-person event had cost £20 a head. We did it online last year and did it for £5, and that was really to cover costs in terms of all of the prep and what have you. And I think we had a very open refunds policy, in that if anybody requested a refund for whatever reason, there would be sort of no quibble, on the basis that we just wanted to make it as easy as possible. And actually nobody asked for a refund. There were quite a few people that on the day commented on a number of technical difficulties, but they didn't request a refund. So I think, you know, it's important to think about, but it does require a little bit of thought, and it probably does require just sort of outlining and writing, even to yourself and your colleagues at the start, just so everybody's on the same page with that sort of thing. I mentioned earlier on, if you want to do any sort of linguistic translation, you're going to need, for Zoom at least, the webinar version of Zoom, and that does require a additional paid for subscription. You can pay for it on a month-by-month basis, so you can just do it for a single month if you've got one event. They may be one of the costs that you need to cover in your pricing, so again, that might be something that does link into that. And if you're working with communities who do speak other languages, whether that's if you're from a part of the UK where there are other languages spoken, such as in Wales where I am, or whether it's because you're dealing with communities either within your own town or city that are speaking other languages, or whether you're dealing with overseas audiences that are speaking other languages, you might want to add translation features. You will also need to cover the cost, obviously, of a qualified translator to do all of that. And there are obviously various agencies around the country that can handle that sort of thing. It is useful to sort of think about and to be aware of. I suppose, as I say, going hand in hand with translation are the suite of accessibility features. Captioning on Zoom and other online meeting platforms is fairly straightforward these days, and if people want captioning, it's quite easy for them to just add captions. I think as hosts we can add additional capacity for people to caption, but also I've looked at some stuff recently where people might want to add a British Sign Language interpreter to enable for sign language interpretation. And again, there are a number of ways of doing that. There are perhaps some shortcuts, but there are some more formal routes to doing it. One simple way is obviously just having a sign language interpreter who is spotlighted, so they always appear on the screen when something is happening, and that's one very simple, straightforward way of doing that. the third feature there in terms of extras that I've considered is the idea around interactivity, and I think one of the points that when we talked at the chat last week about online events was that that interactivity shouldn't just be there for its own sake. And I think perhaps at the start of the pandemic, when we were all suddenly new to Zoom meetings, we were sort of forever being thrown into breakout rooms or going onto various whiteboards on other websites and going and putting imaginary post-it notes on to add an element of interactivity. I think now we're all a little bit more careful about that. We know that there's no point doing it unless there's a real purpose to it. And I think, but I think even so, it's really, really worth considering what you want to be interactive and what you as the host or the organizer is going to get out of that interactivity, but also what the participants are going to get out of that interactivity. Sometimes, obviously, we try to do things like breakout rooms to add sort of slightly more relaxed sort of social elements to online meetings or online conferences. And I don't think that always works. I think you kind of end up with a group of people in a breakout room who aren't necessarily don't know each other, but all trying to sort of speak over each other. One of the limitations, of course, with Zoom is that you can't have more than one person speaking at the same time, and so it kind of gets a bit clunky if two people try and talk at the same time. So that can be quite difficult to kind of have sort of more relaxed, more social kind of conversations. So there might be worth thinking about other ways of doing that. The chat is obviously another simple way of doing interactivity, and quite often when I'm hosting events, I tend to encourage people to use the chat to do the kind of the informal social stuff. And that's one good way of doing it, or just to sort of set up other forums outside of the meeting where people can do that, so more to facilitate those sorts of things. I think in terms of the whiteboard question, and I've been to some meetings and some events recently where we've used an external website to do that, always be mindful of whether those people are going to need to register for the website. We had as I say, a meeting last week, and all of a sudden we were asked to contribute to a kind of a whiteboard scenario with post-it notes, but then the whole meeting was interrupted by about 15 minutes where everybody had to then register for the new website and then send confirmation emails and then find the code to join, and then once you've joined and it all becomes a bit disjointed, and then there were some people that still were having issues accessing, and then they got onto the platform but they couldn't find the right whiteboard. So it needs to be as simple as possible. And again, it goes back to knowing your audience, knowing particularly the technological capacity, the digital literacy of your audience. You know, if you're talking to a room full of tech professionals, digital natives who are completely at home, completely happy to experiment, or will already be using all this stuff, then that's one thing. But if you're talking to an audience who are perhaps lacking in digital confidence, or don't have experience of doing it, have never done it before, then I think you need to be really careful about the sorts of tools that you use to engage interactivity. Certainly things that are built into the platform, so in this case Zoom, are slightly easier, but I think it's always worth testing and experimenting first. So I think with all of the events that I've done, we've always done a couple of test calls ahead of time, a couple of people just talk around it. Some people act as audience, some people act as hosts, just to kind of see what everybody else is seeing and understand it a bit more, and all take it in turns. So I think doing those test calls is always really, really useful, just to kind of walk through everything, do a bit of a dry run, particularly if you want to kind of, as a host, you want to make sure that everything's working as it should do, particularly where you're using new bits of technology. So the first time I was using polls, made sure that we all had it all set up ahead of time and did a couple of test calls with people, just so we properly understand how it was working. When we've done whiteboards, we've done the same. So I think the test calls there are vital, just within your own colleagues or within a few of the trusted individuals. A couple of people, Victoria's asking about subtitles or scripted online talk. Can you upload a transcript in any way to facilitate this? So I think there are some ways of doing it. You can add participants can add captions. There's a whole range of sort of accessibility tools that people will have on their own machines that can add captions. And I think certainly if you're viewing it through a browser such as Chrome, there is a captioning tool in that will automatically caption any video that's coming through there. So that's one way of it will auto caption. Obviously the captions aren't always accurate, and if you're dealing with any technical jargon or complicated place names, or even people with particularly strong regional accents, those auto captions can have some difficulties, and you know, again, working in Wales, the closed captions can never get a Welsh place name accurately. So they're not always great, but there are ways. YouTube will also auto caption in English, but again, it does struggle with other languages and can sometimes struggle with dialect or regional accents and some technical terms and technical jargon. There are ways you can upload transcripts to the chat, but you can also upload documents. You can upload PDFs and things like that. I'm going to see. So Nathan is suggesting sort of a teleprompter type feed for captioning, which is another way. Yeah, you might need a colleague that can perhaps copy paste it into the chat, even as a very sort of simple way of doing it, or you know, I suppose. Yeah, Sean's recommending backup laptops. Thanks, Sean. We're kind of nearly at the end of our hour, and as we said at the start, timekeeping is essential. So there's some contact details. I'm going to paste all these into the chat, and again, that's another little tip: is if you've got web links, don't just put them on the screen, paste them into the chat, because no one can click on a link on a shared screen. So I'm going to come off the screen share, and I'm going to paste these into the chat. So anybody that wants to access any of those, this is all the ways you can contact the Digital Learning Network. I'll also stick my own personal email address in the chat as well. So if anybody wants to drop me an email, you can do.